Imagine this. A young prince, barely old enough to understand the weight of his own crown, standing on the edge of a world determined to erase him. His enemies believed they had crushed his destiny, that death itself had already claimed him. But they were wrong. He slipped through the darkness, survived the unthinkable, and rose into a figure whispered about for centuries. Tonight, you'll discover how a doomed boy became a living legend. History often celebrates the rulers who sat securely on their thrones, commanding armies, shaping empires, and leaving behind monuments carved in stone. But just as often, the most extraordinary stories come from those who were never meant to survive long enough to rule at all. Across centuries, kingdoms have risen and fallen on the fragile shoulders of children born into power. And nowhere is this more hauntingly evident than in the tale of a young prince whose life began with danger, hovering like a shadow over every breath he took. His world was one where loyalty shifted like sand, where even the most trusted advisors could become executioners overnight, and where a single whisper could unravel an entire dynasty. The prince at the center of this story emerged from a time marked by ruthless ambition, choking political rivalries, and a desperate struggle for control that consumed everyone around him. Families that should have been united by blood were torn apart by fear. Generals who had once sworn allegiance watched for the slightest opportunity to seize power. And behind palace walls, silent battles raged, battles of influence, deception, and quiet conspiracies that would shape the future more than any war fought on open ground. To understand the path this prince walked, you have to imagine a kingdom standing at the edge of collapse. Years of tension had hollowed out its foundations, while the royal court still sparkled with gold and ceremony. Beneath that glittering surface lay a cracked, unstable core ready to shatter at the slightest pressure. The throne was not merely a seat of leadership, it was a target. Whoever claimed it would inherit both unimaginable authority and a storm of enemies already sharpening their blades. In such times, a newborn heir was not a symbol of hope, but a spark that could ignite violence. And that is exactly what happened. From the moment he entered the world, forces moved against him, some out of hatred for his bloodline, others motivated by ambition, and some driven by old wounds that had never healed. Yet even in this grim environment, there existed a sense of longing, a desire for stability, and a belief that perhaps this small child might one day bring peace. It was a fragile hope, easily crushed, but it persisted, and that quiet flicker of faith, held by a few brave souls willing to risk everything, would shape the entire journey you're about to hear. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoy dark history stories like this, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your feedback in the comments. From the moment the young prince opened his eyes to the cold glow of dawn inside the stone chamber where he had been hidden, his life became a desperate struggle against forces far older and far crueler than anything a child should ever face. And as you follow his steps now, you'll feel the weight of every whispered warning, every hurried glance, every trembling breath that marked his early years, because those who were sworn to protect him lived in constant fear that the shadows creeping through the palace corridors were not simply tricks of dim torchlight, but living threats intent on tearing him away from the fragile world that had tried to shelter him. And you can almost imagine the way his caretakers listened for footsteps at night, how they tightened their hold on him when distant echoes rose from the courtyard, how they prayed silently that the conspirators moving behind the scenes would overlook the hidden room where he slept, though they knew deep down that hope alone could never stand against the hunger for power that drove his enemies. And as he grew, even before he understood the meaning of betrayal, he sensed danger in the hushed conversations around him, the way adults stopped speaking whenever he entered, the way fear clung to them like frost. And you might think that such a childhood would break a boy, but somehow it sharpened him instead, giving him an instinct for survival that would one day astonish even the hardened generals who eventually served under his command. Yet in those early years, he was just a frightened child watching a kingdom rot from within, seeing servants vanish overnight, noticing that guards who once smiled now carried tension in their shoulders, realizing that the throne meant to be his had become a prize so contested that even his blood relatives plotted to spill more blood. And as he was smuggled from one safe place to another, moving through forests, abandoned outposts, and crumbling monasteries, He learned quickly how fragile trust truly was, because every ally seemed to carry a secret. Every escort watched the trees too carefully. Every shelter felt temporary, and you can picture him riding in silence on stormy nights, clutching a cloak too large for his small hands, listening to the wind pound against the shutters, while the adults whispered plans he could not yet grasp, and you feel the loneliness pressing on him, the confusion of being told he must survive when no one explained why survival demanded such relentless sacrifice. Yet even then, moments of kindness flickered through the darkness. An old monk teaching him to read by lamplight, a wounded soldier showing him how to hold a blade, a nurse humming lullabies in a language older than the kingdom itself. And these tiny acts of humanity shaped him more than any royal decree, because they rooted him in compassion even as he witnessed the cruelty of those who wanted him dead. And when he finally learned the truth, that his father had been poisoned, his mother imprisoned, and his birthright stolen by a council that pretended loyalty while carving up the realm for themselves, something inside him hardened not into hatred but into a quiet, calculated resolve, the kind that grows slowly, steadily, like embers waiting for the right breath to ignite into flame. And as he matured, slipping through enemy territory under false names, he absorbed every story of the suffering caused by those who sat on the throne in his place, hearing villagers speak of crushing taxes, burned farms, conscripted youths dragged into pointless battles, and you can imagine how each testimony carved deeper into his memory, shaping a purpose he had never sought but could no longer avoid. And still his survival was never guaranteed, because assassins trailed him like shadows, forcing him to abandon hideouts the moment he arrived, driving him across mountains where the cold sliced through bone and deserts where the heat blurred vision. And with every escape he felt the world testing him, pushing him toward the limit of endurance. Yet he refused to surrender, for by then he understood that staying alive was not only about reclaiming a stolen crown, but about protecting the countless innocents who had suffered under the tyrants ruling in his name. And the turning point came the night he stumbled upon a village razed to ashes, the smell of smoke still clinging to the air, the silence broken only by the crackling of dying embers, and he walked among the ruins with a heaviness that nearly crushed him, until he found a single survivor, a small girl trembling beneath a collapsed beam. And when he lifted her into his arms, hearing her whisper that soldiers had burned everything because the villagers refused to swear loyalty to the usurpers, he felt a clarity he had never known, a clarity that told him surviving was no longer enough. He had to rise, to fight, to reclaim not only his name but the dignity of every person crushed beneath the weight of corruption. And as he carried the girl through the night, he realized that legends are not born from destiny alone, but from the choices made when the world expects you to fall. And that night, with the stars hidden behind a curtain of drifting smoke, the transformation began. The frightened prince, who once hid in shadow, started becoming the figure history would remember. A figure shaped not by privilege, but by pain, not by entitlement, but by duty. And as dawn broke upon the horizon, he knew that every step forward would demand courage he had never been taught. Yet he took it anyway, beginning the long march toward a legacy forged in fire, sacrifice, and the unyielding conviction that no matter how many times death reached for him, he would not let it define him. And as he continued on that path, gathering those who still believed in the rightful heir, he discovered that leadership was not about issuing commands, but about listening to the broken stories of people who had lost everything. And he learned quickly that fear could be transformed into hope if someone was willing to stand at the front and bear its weight. And you can almost see him now, older but still carrying the echoes of childhood scars, standing before rebels armed with nothing but worn tools and fading courage, telling them that their suffering would not be forgotten, that the cruelty tearing the kingdom apart could be challenged, that even the smallest spark could guide them through suffocating darkness. And though he doubted himself in private, wondering whether he truly had the strength to confront the monstrous machinery of power that had hunted him since birth, he pressed on because turning back would mean surrendering the lives already lost. And his determination began to spread like a quiet rumor, reaching hidden communities, outlaw camps, and forgotten soldiers who had long abandoned dreams of justice. And with each new ally, with each fragile alliance forged under moonlit skies, he stepped further away from the helpless child he had once been and closer to the legend whispered in taverns and borderlands. A legend that spoke of a prince who had escaped death not by accident, but by sheer refusal to let tyranny dictate the end of his story. And as you picture him preparing for what lay ahead, you feel the tension rising, the sense that the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see whether he would survive the storms gathering around him or finally succumb to the relentless forces that had chased him since the moment he entered the world. As the prince's quiet uprising began to spread across the fractured kingdom, drawing in wanderers, deserters, scholars, farmers, and even former palace officials who had grown sick of corruption, he found himself navigating a landscape defined not only by danger, but by the fragile hopes of people clinging to the idea that justice might still be possible. And you can imagine the weight of that expectation pressing against his shoulders as he walked through makeshift camps lit by dim lanterns, listening to men and women recount the horrors they had endured under the usurpers, hearing stories of villages stripped bare, children forced into servitude, sacred sites desecrated, and fields burned to starve rebellious regions into submission. And it was in these soft, painful conversations, shared while sitting beside dying campfires or crouching beside wounded fighters, that he realized how deeply the kingdom had been poisoned, not just by political greed, but by despair, the kind that turns communities inward and convinces them they are alone. And he understood that his rebellion could not survive if it relied solely on strategy or force. It needed to offer something more powerful, something the regime could never manufacture, a sense of unity, of belonging, of a future not dictated by fear. And so the prince began to move among his followers not as a distant leader, but as someone willing to share their burdens, patching wounds alongside healers, gathering wood with laborers, and kneeling beside the grieving families who had lost loved ones in battles he had not even witnessed. And each time he showed such humility, the legends surrounding him grew, some exaggerated, some inaccurate, some almost mythic, but all contributing to an image of a leader who cared more for the people than the throne he had been born to inherit. And with this expanding reputation came new challenges, because the usurpers realized that killing him was no longer simply about eliminating the rightful heir. It was about crushing a symbol, extinguishing the embers of hope spreading across the land. And so they escalated their efforts, sending spies disguised as refugees, planting informants within rebel gatherings, and deploying elite hunters trained to track fugitives across mountains, rivers, and forests. Yet despite these threats, the prince's movement continued to grow, and you can picture him standing in a hidden valley, surrounded by supporters armed with old spears and worn armor, knowing that their faith in him was both his greatest strength and his most terrifying responsibility. For if he failed, their blood would stain his conscience for the rest of his life. And though that fear gnawed at him, he refused to let it guide his decisions, choosing instead to anchor himself in the stories he heard nightly around campfires, stories of resilience, sacrifice, and stubborn defiance. And he realized that rebellion was not merely an armed struggle, but a moral one, a fight against the idea that ordinary people must bow forever to those who rule through cruelty. And with that clarity, he began forming alliances with groups previously considered too dangerous or too fractured to trust, including border clans known for raiding caravans, scholars exiled for questioning official decrees, and former prisoners who had survived the horrors of the usurpers' underground dungeons. And each alliance required delicate negotiation, long nights of tense dialogue, and moments when a single misinterpreted gesture could have sparked violence. Yet somehow the prince navigated these encounters with a blend of caution and courage, earning respect not because he demanded it, but because he listened truly. Listened to the grievances and fears of even the most hardened fighters. And as word of these alliances spread, the people began whispering that the rightful heir possessed not only the bloodline of kings, but the heart necessary to heal the wounds that had divided the kingdom for so long, though the prince himself never allowed such praise to distract him from the grim reality that the usurpers were preparing a campaign to exterminate every rebel stronghold. And the first sign came when smoke rose from the southern horizon, revealing that 3 villages believed to be sheltering his supporters had been destroyed, leaving behind nothing but ashes and silence. And when the prince arrived days later to find charred homes and scattered belongings, he felt a familiar ache, one that echoed the devastation he had witnessed years earlier in the ruined village, where he had rescued the trembling girl. And though grief threatened to crush him, he turned that pain into resolve, speaking to his companions in a quiet voice that carried through the smoky air, telling them that they could not allow fear to break them now, not when so many lives depended on their resistance. And those words, steady and unwavering, rippled through his ranks, strengthening their resolve even as new threats loomed. And it was during this period of escalating conflict that the prince encountered one of the kingdom's oldest legends, the Watcher of the Northern Pass, an enigmatic hermit believed to possess knowledge of forgotten histories and hidden pathways. And though many dismissed the tale as mere folklore, the prince sought the hermit out, guided by the belief that understanding the past was essential for shaping the future. And after a treacherous journey through icy cliffs and narrow ravines, he found the Watcher living in a cave adorned with ancient carvings depicting cycles of rise and collapse, kings and tyrants, rebellions and restorations. And the hermit listened as the prince described the suffering of the people, the corruption of the usurpers, and the fragile alliances holding his rebellion together. And after a long silence, the Watcher revealed a truth that chilled the prince more than any winter wind. The kingdom's turmoil was not born from recent treachery alone, but from generations of unresolved conflicts, hidden betrayals, and suppressed voices. And unless the prince aimed to rebuild not just the throne but the moral foundation of the realm, victory would be temporary, collapsing under the same rut that had destroyed so many dynasties before. And this warning became a turning point, giving the prince a clearer vision, one not focused solely on reclaiming power, but on restoring balance, rebuilding trust, and creating a future in which children would not grow up hiding in shadows as he had. And when he returned to his followers, his renewed sense of purpose radiated through the camps like dawn light cutting through fog, inspiring them to fight not out of vengeance, but out of hope for a better world. And you can almost feel the momentum gathering as plans were drawn, scouts dispatched, and alliances solidified, each step bringing the prince closer to a confrontation that would either free the kingdom or plunge it into deeper darkness. And though he knew the path ahead would test every fragment of strength he possessed, he also knew that legends were not carved from ease but from endurance, sacrifice, and the willingness to face overwhelming odds even when every instinct urged retreat. And so he pressed forward, determined to prove that the child who once fled through forests and ruins would one day return to face the throne that had cost him everything. The final phase of the prince's journey toward legend unfolded like a storm whose approach could be sensed long before the first drops fell. And you can imagine him moving through the territories he had once fled, now returning as a figure of whispered awe, a young man whose eyes carried the memory of every shadowed night and every abandoned village, whose presence alone inspired loyalty among the desperate and fear among the corrupt. And as he approached the heart of the kingdom, he encountered obstacles that tested the full measure of his resilience, because the usurpers, recognizing that mere suppression would no longer suffice, unleashed their full power. Elite soldiers with hardened bodies and sharp blades, spies whose cunning made deception an art form, and traps designed to ensnare even the most cautious. Yet the prince, guided by a combination of intuition honed over years of evasion and the careful counsel of allies who had proven their loyalty through fire and blood, navigated these dangers with a measured precision that seemed almost unnatural, as if every move he made had been calculated by someone who had spent a lifetime anticipating betrayal. And you can picture the tension rising with each step as he approached the capital, the city itself a labyrinth of corrupted officials, secret guards, and terrified citizens, all of whom watched the shifting tides with trepidation. And the closer he came, the more palpable the danger became, for he knew that a single mistake could undo everything he had built. Yet even in the face of overwhelming odds, he pressed forward, because by then survival was no longer merely personal. It had become the lifeline of everyone who had placed their hope in him. And the stories of villages saved, prisoners freed, and tyrants outwitted were now threads in a larger tapestry that he was weaving, one that would define not only his destiny, but the very soul of the kingdom. And as he moved, he recalled the faces of those he had lost along the way, the girl he had rescued in the early days, the villagers crushed by fire, the loyal companions who had perished in ambushes, and their memories fueled a determination that burned. steadily even when despair threatened to cloud his vision, and you can almost feel him pausing on the outskirts of the capital, gazing at the palace walls that once symbolized oppression, now transformed in his eyes into a stage upon which justice and reckoning would play out. And in that moment, the prince realized that the battle ahead would demand more than courage and strategy. It would require a willingness to confront the deepest darkness in human hearts, including his own, because revenge was a temptation that could blind even the noblest intent, and he understood that the difference between a ruler and a tyrant lay in the choices made when the world expects cruelty to prevail, and so he devised a plan that blended cunning, timing, and the careful orchestration of both fear and hope, moving under cover of night to position allies in key locations, sending messages that spread uncertainty among his enemies, and leveraging the whispered support of citizens who had secretly resisted for years, each action a delicate step on a razor's edge, where failure could mean the deaths of hundreds. And yet, despite the staggering risk, he pressed forward with a quiet resolve that inspired those around him. And you can picture the final confrontation unfolding not as a chaotic clash, but as a tense sequence of calculated maneuvers, each side testing the other, each moment pregnant with potential disaster, until the prince, drawing upon everything he had learned through years of flight, loss, and observation, turned the tide through a combination of courage, insight, and a willingness to act when hesitation would have been safer. And the usurpers, for all their power and arrogance, found themselves unable to respond effectively to a leader who had already survived death and the betrayal of nearly everyone around him. And as their forces fractured and fled, the prince moved through the halls of the palace, seeing the empty thrones, the abandoned gold, the symbols of authority stripped of their meaning, and he understood that true leadership was not claiming the seat of power, but restoring the order that allowed people to live without fear. And in those quiet moments, as he addressed the remaining citizens and loyal soldiers, promising justice tempered with mercy, you can sense the transformation from boy to legend, the emergence of a figure whose story would be told for generations, not because he had been handed privilege, but because he had endured every conceivable trial and refused to surrender. And even as celebrations began and the kingdom slowly stabilized, he did not forget the lessons of his youth, the fragility of trust, the dangers of complacency, the weight of responsibility, and he instituted reforms that prioritized safety, fairness, and transparency, ensuring that the horrors he had survived would not be repeated. And you can almost hear him walking among his people in the weeks and months that followed, listening to their fears, acknowledging their losses, and quietly building a system where justice was not a word whispered in fear, but a reality lived daily. And in doing so, he solidified not only his rule but the moral foundation of a kingdom reborn. And though threats would always linger, he faced them with the knowledge that survival alone was no longer the measure of greatness. What mattered was courage, integrity, and the willingness to confront both external enemies and internal doubts. And by the time the prince, now a man of wisdom and tempered strength, looked back on the path that had brought him from a hidden chamber as a frightened child to a palace filled with hope and renewal, he understood that legends are not born from destiny alone, but from endurance, empathy, and an unwavering commitment to rise above the darkness that surrounds us. And you, listening now, can feel the power of that journey, the suspense of a life constantly in peril, and the quiet, steady triumph of a human spirit that refused to be extinguished. A story that reminds us that even in our own lives, when faced with betrayal, fear, and unimaginable loss, the choice to persevere, to act with courage and conscience, can transform tragedy into legacy. And as the prince walked through his restored kingdom, seeing children playing safely in streets that had once known only terror, hearing markets hum with the life of people who had been silenced, and feeling the quiet respect of those who had once doubted him, he became the living embodiment of hope, proof that survival was only the beginning, and that true legend is earned through hardship, vision, and a relentless refusal to let darkness define the story of one's life. Looking back on the life of the prince who escaped death only to become a legend, it's impossible not to feel the weight of everything he endured: the betrayals, the relentless pursuit, the nights spent shivering in hidden corners, and the constant fear that each step could be his last. And yet, what defines him is not simply survival, but the choices he made in the face of unimaginable adversity. He could have allowed hatred to consume him, let revenge dictate his every action, and yet he did not. He chose instead to transform suffering into strength, fear into resolve, and loss into a guiding force for justice. That delicate balance, the ability to remain human while navigating cruelty and chaos, is what elevated him beyond mere royalty and into the realm of legend. Every village saved, every life defended, every alliance forged was a testament to the power of courage coupled with compassion, proving that true leadership is measured not by birthright, but by the care shown to those who depend on you most. His story is a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope can survive, and that ordinary people, children, villagers, outcasts, can influence events in ways history never fully records. As you reflect on his journey, consider how moments of bravery, no matter how small, ripple through the world, altering futures and inspiring generations yet to come. And while his name has been etched into history, the lessons of his life are not confined to the past. They resonate today, calling on each of us to face fear, act with integrity, and persist even when the odds seem insurmountable. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon, like the video, and tell us in the comments what type of stories you'd like to see. Share where you are watching from and how his journey resonates with you. Legends are not just about the deeds of the past. They are about the inspiration they leave behind, the courage they awaken within us, and the hope that even in darkness, we can rise.